This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. A recent UConn study found that 3/4 of Black households with cars in the U.S. spend over 15% of their monthly income on car-related expenses. As many of us know, owning a car is expensive. But for these researchers, one of whom is joining us this morning, they say that transportation shouldn't have to mean car ownership. This hour, we'll hear about some of the efforts to reprioritize walkability and public transportation in the country and here in Connecticut. Joining me now is Dr. Norman Garrick. He's a professor emeritus of civil engineering at the University of Connecticut and based in Zurich, Switzerland. Dr. Garrick, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Catherine. It's nice to be back. It's been 20 years since I first appeared on this show.
It has been a while, and we are very excited to have you back on our airwaves. And also with us is Jeff Speck, who's a city planner and author of Walkable City: How Downtown Can Save America One Step at a Time. Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for joining us today as well.
Good morning from Boston, and excited to be with Norm, whose work I've admired for many years.
Well, we always love that, and it will be a very interesting conversation as we are going to be talking about traffic in general from all aspects in the world. Sounds like from Zurich to Boston to Connecticut. So this will be a very exciting conversation. And for our listeners, let us know, what kind of city planning improvements would you like to see around where you live? Let us know, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Norman, the last time you were on the show, we talked about this concept of car dependency. So, can you talk about why this study is a good example of that, just to sort of refamiliarize our listeners who may not be familiar with that phrase, car dependency?
Yes. Well, before I start, let me just give a shout out to my doctoral student, Quinn Malloy, and my colleague, Dr. Atkinson Palumbo, who both worked on this project. The issue of car dependency was very, very evident in this study because we looked at different types of places in America, dense places with very good transit. And what we found was that in those places, only 50% of people in those relatively dense places with relatively good transit owned cars, whereas everywhere else in the country, we're talking about 90 to 100% owning cars. So one of the things that we wanted to bring out is that car ownership is not always a choice. In fact, it's often forced on people because of how we have built places. So that is the essence of the concept of car dependency.
And we'll definitely be digging deeper into that throughout this conversation today. And Jeff, your 2012 book, Walkable City, was the best-selling city planning title of the past decade, and it's been translated into 7 languages. And you've also recently revisited the book in honor of its 10th anniversary. So I want to start this conversation by asking you to define 2 words that we're going to be talking about today. The first is walkability, and the second is stroads. So what is walkability?
So yes, and the book. Thank you, Kat. The book was reissued with 100 new pages, so I had an opportunity to rethink a lot of these things, and we've learned a lot in the past 10 years. However, my definition of walkability hasn't changed. And this is quite pertinent to what Norm was saying. A walkable place from my perspective, or I would say from the perspective of best practices in city planning, is not a place where no one owns cars or where cars are absent from the landscape, but it's essentially a place where the car exists as an optional instrument of freedom rather than a prosthetic device that you need to live your daily life. So I go a little bit deeper, and we can spend more time perhaps later digging into these categories, but I go a little bit deeper into asking what makes a place walkable. And the answer is, of course, the walk has to be as good as the drive. And to do that, it has to do 4 things simultaneously. It has to be useful, it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable, and it has to be interesting. And if you can satisfy those 4 criteria, you will end up with a community in which people are making the choice to leave the car at home, to perhaps own one fewer car, or maybe to have no cars at all.
And we're also going to be talking about stroads, which I think would be, it was a new phrase for me, might be a new phrase for a lot of our listeners. So can you define what exactly is a stroad?
A stroad is a word that was invented by Chuck Marohn, who founded the Strong Towns movement, but is perhaps better known among my friends as being the author of a book called Confessions of a Recovering Engineer, which I'm sure Norm is very familiar with. But a stroad is a street and a road. It's a thoroughfare which is attempting to be both a street and a road and is failing at each. And he defines it as being like a futon, which is something was designed to be either both a sofa and a bed, but is a bad sofa and also a bad bed. And to get a little bit deeper, streets, in contrast to roads, are places that exist principally to generate economic activity and social activity, whereas roads are places that exist principally to move people between two destinations. And so a proper road actually is pretty speedy and doesn't have addresses on it, doesn't have curb cuts, doesn't have people cutting in and out to get to big box stores and other private property, making it inefficient at moving people from place to place. The contrast in a street, if you design a community street to be about moving many people quickly, then it fails as a place of commerce because people are moving too fast and too dangerously. And so many of the thoroughfares on which Americans live and work and shop of transportation to be both streets and roads, attempting to both serve commerce and to move people quickly. And they're extraordinarily dangerous and, of course, unwalkable, and also not very good at moving people around.
Well, the moment you mentioned futon, my back started hurting. And I also started to get a lot of images of these stroads in cities and places that I've lived across the country. And Jeff, you also wrote of stroads that, here's a quote that I want to share here. It's, "Our mistake over the years is that we have allowed streets to become half roads and roads to become half streets. On one, as you mentioned, commerce has been sacrificed to speed. And on the other, speed has been sacrificed to commerce." So can you expand on this idea? Because I think myself included in this, I don't know if I've ever lived in a world where stroads didn't exist.
Well, you're younger than me.
I just dated myself.
and Norm. But it's interesting for me to see how over the 50 years that I've been observing things, perhaps a little bit with some attention, the way that the places around me have grown. And so I can think of, for example, what you'd have to call the downtown of it's the state highway interchange of Derry, New Hampshire, which is not Derry, New Hampshire, Raymond, New Hampshire, which is a town that I pass through every time I'm driving to our cabin on the lake in New Hampshire. And when I started going there 50 years ago, it was just a crossroads. But in the ensuing 50 years, it has grown in the way that almost every rural area in America has grown. In contrast to the way that cities used to grow, in which areas were annexed and planned and laid out with networks of streets and then distributed to developers, the way that most of the U.S. has grown is that a highway is laid through it, even if it's just a 2-lane or 4-lane state highway. And then individual developers have been allowed to, of course, to develop parcels along it and turn it into a car sewer surrounded by a strip shopping center, a supermarket, every chain store you might imagine, a lot of auto-centric businesses, and a absolute placelessness, unwalkable and dangerous to drive around because of the process by which land is developed in the United States, without any step first to lay in the fundamentals of making a walkable place, which, for want of a better definition, is lots of small blocks and small streets.
And Norm, we'll love your take on the idea of a stroad, and especially where you live now in Zurich, Switzerland. Is that common where you live?
Not at all. I can walk almost the entire city with feeling in control as a pedestrian. The cars always stop. The roads are typically just two lanes. So one lane in each direction. The speeds are slow. So it's really a walking paradise, this city. Um, in contrast, where I still have a house in Stores, a really good example of a stroad there is what is called 195 or Stores Road in the center of town that has become more like a street. But as soon as you go south of the university town, you get into Stroad country. And so when I have to walk home, it's really harrowing to have to cross Stores Road south of Stores downtown.
And Jeff, earlier you mentioned one of the criteria for walkability is interesting. And actually, I found that to be interesting. So would you say stroads are interesting? Do stroads meet any of those criteria for walking? Because as I mentioned earlier, I'm having images of stroads, and I think some I feel like I can walk in and some not so much.
Well, it's really interesting to think about the economic story of how these places are developed with extremely low values. So when you don't lay in a street network, when you don't create a plan that has, or grow, for example, the edges of a city or town in the same form of that city or town, with small streets and small blocks, you don't create a nexus of value. And so the only sort of businesses that tend to arrive on these stroads are those businesses that thrive on the high speed environment, and that is the chain stores. So it's not only not interesting to travel on a stroad because every business is a business chain store that you've already heard of, like
Right.
the Dollar General or the Speedway or the Dunkin' Donuts. It's also not interesting to travel around the US. The minute you get out of any city, whether it's Fredericksburg, Virginia as a tourism destination, or Santa Fe, New Mexico, doesn't matter where you are. These areas these donuts that surround our historic and interesting downtowns all look exactly like each other as well. So the economics of this sort of land development create a extraordinarily boring national landscape.
Well, and it's so. I mean, we're going to have to come up with a different word than interesting at the end of this conversation. But it was very fascinating to me that you're making this observation, because one of my observations casually as a driver, because I road tripped out here from the West Coast to the East Coast when I made my move, and that was exactly it. I would go through spaces where at one point I'm like, oh my God, I'm states and states away from my hometown, but it looks very familiar. So on the one hand, I feel familiar in the good way, and on the other hand, like you're saying, it's not that interesting. Even though I've crossed thousands and thousands of miles, and I find myself in the same plaza, and sort of on that same note too, Jeff, there have also been more conversations around what's called 15-minute cities and also third places. And both are ideas about how city planning affects access. So can you tell us what 15-minute cities and third places are, and what's your take on how this idea of walkability has gained traction in recent years?
So there are kind of two different ideas that are correlated. Third places is something we've been talking about for maybe 30 years, is just this idea of another place that's not your home and not your office where you choose to spend your time. And it's a sort of place that thrived when we had that time, when we weren't
Right.
spending an hour getting to work and an hour getting home, when we weren't driving our kids to school because the school that they were going to is not in our neighborhood, or the school in our neighborhood was not adequate. Of course they still exist. They tend to be places where, if you're going to meet people and advance society by having conversations with people who are strangers and become friends, that's where it's going to happen. And of course, those have been really undermined by the growth of the car commute, and also the fact that, these are places where people drink and then get home from. And that's also why we have a tremendous epidemic of drunk driving in the US, because, the classic roadhouse, which used to be the
Right.
exception to the rule is now the standard. And Kat, I know a lot of people who follow all the laws, who drink and drive. It's kind of this hidden secret of so many communities. There are a lot of people, upstanding citizens, and you know who you are, who drink and drive, and you shouldn't do it, but our landscape kind of makes you do it if you want to have that kind of social life. That's third places. The 15-minute city is a great concept because it's gotten us all talking, but with all fairness to Carlos Moreno, who coined the phrase, it's kind of the same idea in a new box. And we find it a little bit confusing because actually a 15-minute city by bicycle is a huge city. Right. It doesn't really describe the intention of the terminology, which is that basically all of your daily needs should be within 15 minutes of convenience. And that does happen in a beautifully traditionally organized community like mine here in the Boston area. And similarly, I lived in Washington, D.C. for 10 years, and literally, the incredible convenience of, and I guess I am the only doctor in DC who was on time with his patients, but the incredible convenience, I could get to a doctor's appointment, get home, and have the appointment in 45 minutes.
Wow, that is amazing.
That's the kind of neighborhood I lived in. Those of us who have experienced it know how much better and more efficient and happifying that kind of life is. But the 15-minute city is is a term that has been kind of hijacked by conspiracy theorists, and other people have created this kind of false controversy around it that I don't think we need to get into because it's just a smokescreen. But the basic concept of organizing cities in a way that by walking, by biking, and by transit, almost everything you need is within 15 minutes is, of course, the best way to live.
And so we've been talking a lot about cities, but Norm, I want to ask about more rural areas as an important piece in this conversation too, especially in a state like Connecticut. And we were just having a conversation earlier that, we would love to not have cars, but like you said at the top of the hour, sometimes it's actually forced on us rather than a choice. So what about rural areas? What is that conversation like?
Well, it's not that different. In fact, I would say most of Connecticut is not at all rural. I would say Connecticut we have lost rural and we have lost city. We have lost urban and we have lost rural. So we are just in between. Everything in Connecticut is suburban. And by suburban, I mean places that you need a car to access.
Sure.
50, 60, 70 years ago, Connecticut was not like that. We had cities then, like Bridgeport, like Hartford, functioned like cities. And the small towns around it were dependent on some services in those cities, but also they had a lot of local services. One example are schools where the trend is for larger and larger rural regional schools. So that means that when kids 7, 8, or 9 could walk to schools, now we think that it's much more cost efficient to bus them across town or to another town for schooling. And so there's a lot that is lost. And one of the problems is we tend to look at the first cost, the initial cost of things, without stopping to think of the longer term costs, but also of all the systems that, for example, support getting to school, having a school in the neighborhood, etc. So a lot of the conversations about cities also applies to how we need to start thinking about how the places outside of cities need to be organized.
Well, we'll be digging deeper into this conversation. You've been listening to Norman and Jeff, who'll be staying with us, and we'll continue this conversation after a quick break. We also want to hear from you. How do you rate the walkability where you live, and what kind of city planning improvements would you like to see? Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. This hour, we're joined by two renowned city planners and civil engineering experts talking all things walkability and the scourge of the so-called stroad, which is a street-road hybrid. And we want to hear from you. Let us know if you're able to walk around where you live, and also what kind of city planning improvements would you like to see. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Jeff, I know you recently spoke in Westport and offered some suggestions for city planning. So can you talk about what that experience has been like and some of the takeaways from that?
So I spoke in Westport just a few weeks ago. I spoke in New Canaan maybe 4 months ago, and I know Connecticut pretty well. In fact, much of my family hails from New Haven before the Boston era. So for the Boston Speck era. And on the topic of stroad, I'm sure everyone listening is familiar with the Post Road, Highway 1, and how that passes through cities like Westport, where it's the worst road in town, although not so bad because the State Department of Transportation has been willing to make certain concessions along the road when it passes through urban centers. But then, of course, the minute it leaves the center of Westport or other cities and towns like it, it becomes that classic stroad, exactly the poster child of the concept. US 1 in Westport is a perfect example of how these roads undermine our communities. And in discussing the evolution of our cities, so far for 20 minutes, there's been a lot of doom and gloom, right? About how we've lost the path from making successful places. And it is easy to be kind of disappointed in where we've landed. But I did want to share that a lot of great things are happening, and there's a lot of great things that we can do and are doing in our towns and cities to make them better and more walkable again. A lot of it has to do with street design, because the typical street, and certainly the typical state-owned street in our city centers, which for many of us is the main street, has been designed very badly. And that's a long story about how the profession of street engineering in the US grew out of the profession of highway engineering. And there's a misunderstanding that the things that make highways safe make streets safe. Now, there's an incredible book that just came out by a student of norms named Wes. What's Wes's last name?
Wes Marshall.
By Wes Marshall, called, his dad was my track coach in high school, but that's unrelated. And the book is called Killed by a Traffic Engineer. And he tells the story that many of us have been telling for many years, that you actually don't get, if you become a civil engineer in America, unlike in Europe, where you may have to take 12 to 15 classes in road design and road safety, in the US, you're lucky if you've taken 1 or 2. And probably only a little bit of that was about safety. And the part that was about safety was about highway safety. Now, in a highway in which your speed is determined by the speed limit, in other words, how fast you're going is a function of the speed limit sign, anything you can do to add forgiveness makes that street safer. So wider lanes, fewer intersections, one-way travel, the absence of parked cars, clear zones, the absence of trees, all that stuff makes a highway safer. But think about how you set your speed when you're in a settled area or in a downtown. You're not looking at speed limit signs at all. You're responding to your environment. And in fact, anything that you do to increase the elbow room, to increase the forgiveness of that street, makes you go faster, which makes it much more dangerous. And there's a logarithmic relationship, an exponential relationship, between speed and injury. So that a car going 35 miles an hour is 7 times as likely to kill you than a car going 25 miles an hour. So keeping speeds down in city centers is super important. Well, US 1, when it passes through Westport, has 14-foot driving lanes. A highway lane is 12 feet wide normally. A downtown lane should be 10 feet wide or even narrower. It has 14-foot lanes. So of course, people don't feel comfortable walking on it. And that's just one example of what you can find in so many American downtowns. And a lot of the work that we do as planners, and I found my career, move slowly but inexorably from architecture to urban planning to city planning to street design, because it's by redesigning our downtown streets and downtown street networks that we've had the most impact in making places more walkable.
And of course, related to what we're talking about, because we're focusing on streets and designs and infrastructure. But Norm, I also want to talk about, what do you think it is about deprioritizing cars that is also a pretty hot trending issue, and how do you go about educating without implicating?
Yes, I think programs like these are so important, and that's why I mentioned I've been featuring on this program for over 20 years, and over that time, the discussion has changed, and there are more and more people understanding the impact of urban design, the impact of placemaking. And I think that's really a start, is to have at least some people that realize the connections between these different issues. And the only way there are so many forces that are pushing in other direction to keep the status quo. There are lots of people, car sellers, car manufacturers, people that sell gas, and people that want to develop and move on to our next plot of land. All of those people want to keep the status quo, and we are bombarded. I think about watching a UConn basketball game, and the amount of car ads that I see is just mind bending. In comparison, when I go to the movies here, there are ads, but they're ads for train, for transit, etc. So you are already in a different mindset, starting to think about what makes a place work,
Right.
and understand what changes are needed. But it's not any one thing. It's going to be all of these things working together, and really understanding things like just how expensive it is to own cars and how much it costs us, not just in terms of the environment or in terms of gas importation, but how much it costs the state, the city, and the individual to keep this lifestyle going. So I think all of those things coming together might have us starting to move in a different direction.
And Norm, I should say there's a slide, you're not aware of this, but I have a slide that is one of your slides with your face next to it from a Zoom lecture that you gave in 2021 that I use in all my lectures. And it talks about how, in the US, we spend, I think it's $12,000 per year for each car that we own, or the typical American, spends $12,000 per year for transportation, whereas the typical person in Switzerland spends $6,000 per year for transportation.
Well, it's actually worse than that, because my own personal experience with my two-person family, we spend less than $3,000 for access to the entire country. Last week we were in Italy and Austria, and that trip cost us 60 Swiss francs. So compared to having two cars in the US, which would be more like 16,000 per year, it's really an unbelievable burden to own cars.
Well, and I think
there was a recent study in Boston. Sorry, Kat. There was a recent study in Boston that found the typical Bostonian might pay, or Massachusetts resident might pay $12,000 a year for driving, but that is subsidized by the same people, right? Because we pay taxes to subsidize. That's right. Subsidized by by the various levels of government, $14,000 a year. So the combined cost is $26,000 a year per family for transportation.
Well, I think with what both of you have been talking about, this reality for, I think, most of us who do rely on a car or two cars in a family, it's a huge burden in many ways. And so I'm wondering, because public perception is also a huge piece of this conversation, and I'm wondering, Norman, especially earlier you mentioned that we are sort of moving forward, there are changes, but it's going to take a while for, I think, the public to get used to certain things, say roundabouts, for example, as a potential solution for certain traffic patterns. Can you talk about the public perception? Are we fast? Are we slow? What is that looking like for you?
Well, in some ways fast, because when I started teaching about these issues at UConn, the pushback both from the faculty and from the students was tremendous, Now, I talk about these issues, and the students are they very much embrace these ideas. So there is change happening. The question is, how do we get the political structure and the financial structure to change? And that is probably going to take some more of these current generation getting into positions where they have influence and can make change.
And also with those changes in mind too, Norm, you mentioned earlier that there are so many factors that's compounding this conversation. And I think one of the solutions that we have here in the U.S., they're often band-aids. I can think of potholes, for example. It's usually filling them up before you can actually take the whole road and strip it and fix it in a foundational way. So it sounds like the band-aid solution is still very much apparent. So can you talk about how is that a part of this conversation, you think?
Well, in the past, I would see band-aids like there has been, say, 10 years ago, there was a discussion in Connecticut about complete streets. And I knew it was a very flawed concept. Often what it meant was just slapping a bike lane onto a very fast road. And that was a very dangerous thing to do. But for me, it seemed like it was a step forward. But what happens often is that we get stuck with those first steps and we never move the conversation forward. So that is just one example. But this example of the 15-minute city, for example, also get hijacked in all kinds of ways that stops the conversation at a certain level. So yeah, there's a lot of band-aid, there's a lot of talk. There is a talk about Vision Zero, which means that we should try to reduce traffic fatality. But again, that gets hijacked by people that don't really want to examine their own role in to why America is the developed country with by far the worst traffic fatality rates in the world.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned Vision Zero because I actually want to ask you more about that program, which is an effort to reduce traffic fatalities. We've had multiple conversations on this show about how data is showing that traffic fatalities is rising as we speak. And you did give a shout out for one of your students earlier who is looking beyond the Vision Zero program. So can you give listeners an idea of what the program is about and also a preview or an update of what's happening with it?
Yes, Vision Zero is an idea that came out of both the Netherlands and Sweden. And the idea is a very radical idea is that people should not be, we should not have people being killed by cars. We should not have people being killed in their everyday lives as they try to get around. So our goal for traffic safety should be to reduce the number of people being killed to zero. Obviously a very ambitious goal. But what you found was after those countries implemented Vision Zero, the traffic fatality has plunged in those countries and are 1/4, 1/5 of the rate in the US. In contrast, the US continues, and in fact, since 2009, we have had a continuous spike in traffic fatality, not just for people in cars, but especially for pedestrians.
And Norm, let me
Yeah.
add a little detail that Vision Zero is specifically about pedestrian deaths, not automotive fatalities. And some countries like Norway have achieved zero pedestrian deaths in a year as a result of implementing these programs. In the US, the number of pedestrian deaths has increased 82% in the last dozen years.
Wow.
Yeah, yes. But one of the things about Vision Zero is the sense that traffic fatality is the responsibility of everybody involved in the transportation enterprise, the drivers, the users of the road, the car manufacturers, the designers of streets, the insurance companies, the government that sets policies, etc. A lot of places in the US have adopted the slogan, but they're not willing to say what is our role and how can we improve our role in the process. So in preparing for this program, I was looking at one of the reasons that is being put forward by the Insurance Institute is that cars are getting bigger and bigger. And so if you get hit by a car, you're much more likely to die these days than even 10 years ago. And I'm really glad to see at least the insurance company paying attention to part of their role. But I would like to see them go forward and to have that expressed in things like insurance rates. So that's where the responsibility of the different parties start to show when people are doing things that can change this upward trend in traffic fatality.
Well, we got to go to break soon, but I do want to take a quick call. Before we do that, Sylvia from Bolton is calling in. Sylvia, you are on air.
Thank you so much for my call. I live in Bolton, Connecticut, and I'm aware that Manchester is considering what you guys are talking about, complete streets design for its main street, which is could be much more vibrant than it is right now. And there's so much kickback from residents and shop owners. And I just wonder if you have any advice about how to change the narrative to let people understand what it could be, because I don't think many people have much vision or experience of, riding or living in a place where you have a complete streets design and a safe, wonderful, vibrant downtown center that's so possible in Manchester. We're so close, but if these shop owners and townspeople prevent it from happening, it'll be really very tragic. So I just was wondering what your thoughts are on that. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your call. I don't know, Norm or Jeff, who wants to take this one?
So I think one of the things that people learn from is other places that have implemented changes. So for example, I would say go to Northampton or to West Hartford or even to Middletown. The problem is that it's hard for people to understand that their places can be like Northampton because they think Northampton was always Northampton. But I can't think of any better way but to go to places like that have made changes and that have really vibrant life, commercial life, and great livability, great walkability.
And really quickly, Jeff, because earlier we were talking about public perception as well, response to Sylvia?
So I'm sorry, I'm in an urban condition, so there's a garbage truck moving a dumpster out my window, which you're probably hearing in the background. Manchester is one of so many cities that has a state highway as its main street. And so that state highway is running through. It's got 4 full lanes on it with parallel parking on one side and angle parking on the other. And what we do when we look at main streets like that is to say, okay, what is the traffic volume on that street? Does it really need to be 4 lanes, for example? Because if it isn't, then there's room for other things. Interestingly, and this is a fascinating trick that we've been able to bring to bear in many communities, when you turn a 4-lane road into a 3-lane road, in other words, when you replace the 2 fast lanes that are also dangerously turn lanes with a single center turn lane, so you turn the 4-laner into a 3-laner, you reduce injury accidents dramatically, but the volume of traffic on the street does not go down. So a state highway transportation bureau might say, oh, well, we can't change the street because we have a responsibility to move vehicles. Well, in fact, when you turn a 4-laner to a 3-laner, you move just as many vehicles as before. So if that's not being contemplated for Manchester, it should be. And Manchester is very typical of the sort of city that my firm, Speck Dempsey, goes into to make changes of this type.
We'll be continuing this conversation after a quick break. Norman and Jeff will be staying with us, and we want to hear from you. Let us know if you have any questions. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Back with us to talk all things roads are two celebrated city planners and civil engineering experts. We got Dr. Norman Garrick, who's a professor emeritus of civil engineering at the University of Connecticut, and also Jeff Speck, who's a city planner and author of Walkable City. And don't forget, you can join the conversation. Give us a call, 888-720-9677, or leave us a comment on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So to both of you, we've been talking about a lot of different conversations that involve climate change. And I think speaking of road infrastructure, this is actually, it plays an important role here. I want to start with Norm. Can you talk about why is this such an important and very much an underrepresented piece of the city planning conversation when we're talking about climate change?
I'm not sure why it's undervalued, because almost or over 30% of the CO2 emissions in the US comes from transportation. So it should be a big piece of the puzzle. But again, maybe I should go back and say, I do know why. In the US, a lot of discussions about changing the paradigm and reducing carbon is about technology. It's always about technology, electric cars, finding ways of doing exactly the same thing that we have been doing for the last 50 years and not changing anything about how we live. And this is why I have focused my research on things like safety and the affordability piece and the equity piece, because some of the changes that we are that are needed to correct the safety piece, the equity piece, the livability piece, the walkability piece are also changes that would go a long way into help us reducing the amount of carbon that we are producing. So we can't be just thinking of one thing. We need to think of the system as a whole and the implications of changing that system. And when we talk about changing how we live, we need to recognize that we're talking about improving how we live. But for a lot of people, change is scary, even if it could potentially lead to an improvement.
Right. And I think it makes sense to talk about how we live on a show called Where We Live. So that was a perfect transition, really. And then also, we're taking calls this hour and have Trey on the line. Trey, you have the floor.
Hi, I'm calling from Newtown, and I just had a question because I heard the lady from Manchester speak about how basically her town is having a lot of backlash against their complete streets makeover. And I don't know Manchester super well, but I know that Newtown is pretty rural and we really don't have many pedestrians. Our main street isn't super hot like West Hartford, for example. And we really aren't having, I can't think of any pedestrian fatalities that we have had. So I'm just wondering what suggestions you might have on how we could have more of a push to have a more walkable main street area without the impetus of the fatalities to make things safer, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Trey, for taking the time and giving us that call. Jeff, maybe this question might be for you.
Yeah, I don't know Newtown very well, but I have Google, and while Trey was speaking, I was looking at the center of Newtown, which is essentially a highway, the Grand Army of the Republic Highway, or Churchill Road, that has a whole bunch of parking lots with mostly chain stores sitting on it. It's developed in the same way that I described Raymond, New Hampshire is developing, where things were allowed to grow up around that highway. The idea that a rural place like that is going to develop a traditional walkable main street is fairly unlikely in today's economic picture, because it just doesn't have the density or the bodies to support that. I would say that, when a firm like mine works in places like Newtown, our goal is to consider how people might have a less car-dependent lifestyle in that environment, particularly when things are quite spread out in a way that walking isn't going to get you to very many things. Often the solution is bike lanes. and bike lanes perhaps not in the roadway, but along the side of the roadway or in some other way protected from the higher speed traffic. I know that in both New Canaan and in Westport, we discovered locations where, without reducing the number of driving lanes, because that's often difficult on these country roads, which are typically 2 lanes, we could put protected bike lanes on one side of them. For example, in Westport, down 3 different streets, not next to each other, but sequentially, to get you from downtown to the beach, right? Wouldn't that be a wonderful bike access? So in places like this that are more rural, I think the ambition of having a traditionally organized Main Street when you did not inherit one is not likely to be satisfied. But there are ways to improve connectivity, mostly through biking.
And so I think we have
May I
time
just
for
add that I just wanted to
really
add
quickly,
that,
Norm. Yep.
yes, an example of a place that has done a really good job in increasing walkability in a rural environment is Coventry, Connecticut. And you never used to see people walking in Coventry, but they've built a lot of bike paths and walking paths along the main road. And now you see a lot of people walking for exercise or to get to school, etc. So that's a good model for a place like Newtown.
So we only got about 2 minutes left. I want to get to one more question for Norm. Jay just called to ask about parking in town centers. Businesses are pushing back because they're afraid that losing parking will impact volume of business. So Norm, your advice in 60 seconds.
Well, in general, most towns have too much parking and they're not hurt by having less parking. In a lot of places, you just need to count and see how the parking is being used. And that's one way to start the conversation.
Right. Thank you so much for that. And just one last comment from Connecticut resident Ben, who called in and shared being over in Paris last week and having lived there 20 years ago, not just in bike lanes and safety, but also noise pollution. There's a lot we can do to improve our systems. And thank you so much, Ben, for taking time and calling in. And we're going to try to do our best to improve those systems by keeping these conversations going. You've been listening to Dr. Norman Garrick, who's the Professor Emeritus of Civil Engineering at UConn. Thank you so much, Norm, for being with us today.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Always a pleasure to have you on. And also Jeff Speck, who's a city planner and author of Walkable City. Jeff, it was a pleasure having you on as well.
Thanks for having me, Kat. I look forward to coming back.
I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Katie Pellico. Our technical producer is Dylan Reyes. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app. Thank you so much for listening and drive safely, everyone.